Hello and welcome back. Our next session is about succession planning, a process that has often been neglected in talent management, except at the very top. And yet it's so critical in terms of skills and strategic planning and building and executing the strategy. Our next speaker, Jason Serrato, is Senior Director of Product Marketing at Eightfold. He works with their comprehensive talent intelligence platform and app marketplace. Jason is also the co-host of the New Talent Code podcast, and I've certainly put that on my list, Jason. Jason will then introduce our next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amy. I appreciate your introduction and for allowing us to be here today as part of today's agenda. I'm so excited to be joined by Maria Howard as we talk about succession planning, agile, and always on. Maria is partner and general manager for Heidrick Digital, as part of Heidrick & Struggles. An experienced business leader, Maria is an executive in Heidrick's digital business, and Maria and her team advise clients on how to drive the digital transformation leadership, blending with technology and leadership solutions to transform their people management processes across the talent lifecycle. So excited to have this conversation. Welcome, Maria.
Happy to be here with you, Jason. Thank you.
So today we're going to talk about how a skills-based approach relates to the topic of succession planning and this concept of agile and always on. And we'll discuss both the organizational and employee sides of the puzzle, how organizations can plan in the face of uncertainty, ways to use data and technologies in new ways, as well as discuss change management and provide some real-life examples and key takeaways during our short time together today. So let's jump right in. So earlier this year, Eightfold conducted a survey with more than 250 HR leaders and close to 1,000 employees. And I wanted to share a few of the findings here to help level set our conversation today. You know, the last few years have especially been challenging for HR, and as things return to quote unquote normal, the challenges, changes, and priorities aren't getting any easier. It has never been a more challenging, but at the same time exciting time to be in HR, as HR leaders are truly trying to transform and design the organization of the future. You know, one of the biggest challenges is that it takes a lot to address these changes, and there's a lot to take on all at once. So as you can see here, there's a lot of competing priorities. You know, talent is always top of mind, and two areas that HR leaders are currently juggling is cross-training and upskilling existing employees for career development into new roles, and while at the same time identifying high performers to promote internally. Now, on their face, these priorities don't seem all that different from any survey conducted over the last 10 or 20 years. But as the nature of work has changed, where we work has changed, and what we are working on has changed, you know, the way we need to approach these priorities has been completely disrupted. You know, everything has become more democratized and flat and dynamic and real time, and as we say here, agile and always on. You know, HR teams have always been challenged with finding new ways to do things, and in most cases, this requires both changing processes and incorporating new tools. You know, Maria, how do these survey results compare to what you are seeing with some of the clients you're working with?
Well, they're incredibly similar, right? To your point, the topics of how to best manage talent and leaders and make critical decisions has been ongoing. But the way we have to get that done is completely different, both in accounting for remote work, in accounting for these big global macroeconomic changes we're facing, an incredibly tight labor market. And so we're continuously being asked to do more with less time, less resources, less opportunity. And so I think it's a really pivotal moment to actually clear out that playbook and start over to a certain extent. Most organizations have really good talent management processes in place, but I think we have the opportunity to think differently about how we approach them. And that, I think, is what's most exciting, even though the trends are certainly putting all of our HR leaders in a difficult place right now.
And I think not only is it a conversation of doing more with less, it's a conversation of doing more with less for more. So even though it's a high priority, organizations are struggling to offer things like career advancement to all employees, especially in the hybrid, remote, asynchronous way people are working today. It's not very always evident to understand how to do this when you're trying to do this for everyone. This is another cut of the data from that research study. And these are the results from those HR leaders that were surveyed. Only 35% of the HR leaders that were surveyed said they have a way to offer all employees the opportunity to pivot into new roles or areas within the organization. And only 34% said they had a mechanism to show all employees visibility into the skills that may be needed throughout the organization. A topic we've probably been talking about throughout today's agenda. And only 32% said they offered the ability for all employees to have visibility into different career paths and different options across the organization. So even with these capabilities in place, there's always this push and pull of finishing today's work while planning for tomorrow and offering things to everyone while still accomplishing things and moving the organization forward. Maria, how have you seen this challenge amongst kind of talent strategies and HR leaders and hiring managers surfacing?
Yeah, we've got an influx of challenges, right? To your point, we've talked for a long time about own your own development, own your own journey. But if people don't know what matters for the business, how can they do that? If there's not a transparent way to have those conversations, how empowered can they be to chart their course forward? And I saw some interesting statistics that talked about specifically with the Gen Z population, 50% are planning to leave their company in less than a year, and 71% expect a promotion within the next 18 months. So when we think of not only the challenge of how we do this, but the expectations our employees have of us, it's a conundrum. And I think what we need to find is how can we create that neutral point. I would say that the third piece that's hard about this, not just for HR, not just for the employees, but it's the managers who often get caught in the middle. How do I have this conversation with an employee? I don't know all the opportunities that are available. I'm trying to get work done. What does that look like? So it's the place where we've got all these people involved and who all want to do the right thing, but not the right tools, access, data to be able to do that. So that's what I think is the point of transformation we're about to head into as an industry in this area, is if we can lead the digital transformation of how you do that, you can simplify this and actually unite everybody in one approach versus having to kind of leave it in every individual's hand, which is incredibly hard to scale.
As I was hearing you cite those stats, it made me take a deep breath, because it's just a lot to add to this very consuming, challenge and puzzle. And when you think about it, there's another element to some of the areas you raised, and that's the role of managers. I think the role of managers has changed drastically, and we're putting more and more on managers' plates, while also the way that they are being asked to manage and the way their team is operating is changing entirely. So there's a lot of levers and buttons and knobs to push as organizations try to address some of these challenges and change some of these programs and go through not only digital transformation, but organizational transformation. And it's not necessarily going to be a silver bullet, right? There's a lot of nuances and organizational listening and employee feedback and pieces that'll help bring us into the future. I have one last chart to share, I promise. And this one is from that same survey, but now we're talking about it from the employee perspective. So these are the over close to 1,000 employees that participated in our survey. And the percentages here reflect the responses that were either listed as extremely important or very important. And when you look at these areas that were highlighted of having strong levels of importance, the key takeaway here is employees do want to have some ability to feel like they're in the driver's seat. Right? So this chart highlights responses to the following questions. Regarding your career, how important is it to you that your employer offers each of the following? Each of these areas: clearly defined application and interview processes, opportunities for promotion, effective performance reviews, opportunities to work on projects outside of your existing role. They're looking for guided paths, and there could be many. They just want to be able to identify them and know what they are and how to potentially get there or factor them into what plan they have for their own career. And they also want to understand that, for years we've heard a lot about this phrase, trust the system. That if we have to trust the system, then what is it? How does it work? What are the rules? And, there's a lot of discussion around transparency and greater visibility. And we talked about that kind of democratization of opportunities. I think a lot of that comes from data, a lot of that comes from new tools, a lot of that comes from changing culture. Maria, how are you seeing organizations kind of addressing those wants and needs at the employee level and maybe using data or more agile approaches to address some of these concerns?
Yeah, well, one of the things I'm talking to a lot of CEOs about is how do you leverage high tech to go high touch, right? Where can you, so much of our time is spent right now on gathering information. It's fragmented, it's usually manual, it takes a lot of people and a lot of time to just get that point in time view. And then comes all the other things. How do we develop? How do we retain? How do we promote? How do we have cross-functional mobility? So I think what we're seeing is how can we make sure that that data gathering piece is quick and efficient and available and on, so that you can make differentiated determinations of what you're going to do about it. Those are the pieces that are incredibly important to be high touch. I also think we just need to talk about it more and kind of be honest about it. I was sitting in on a town hall of a client of ours, and it was a senior leadership team, and they talked about how this is difficult. We're working to find a solution. We know it's not good enough yet. Stay with us. I think sometimes we wait for the perfect positioning or package or answer to it, and it's complex. I think sometimes just that transparency and a little bit of vulnerability to say, this matters, you matter, and it's a hard thing to answer, so stick with us. Here's what we have now, here's where we're going. It can actually go a really long way to make people feel like there's something actually happening.
On that note, I love how you say, here's where we are now, here's where we're going. One of the hardest parts is just understanding where we're going. So oftentimes planning fails in the face of uncertainty, and even the best laid plans and even extensive projects that take months end up becoming shelfware, right? How do organizations plan in the face of uncertainty with everything that's facing organizations today?
I think there's a couple interesting things going on. We have an annual Route to the Top study that it really examines CEO trends, right? And what we found in the past year is that more CEOs have experience beyond those traditional feeder roles of a CFO or a COO. We're seeing people who are chief risk officers, strategy, chief technology officers ascend into that role because organizations for the future and business and change and transformation they're going to go through need fresh perspectives. So if we're having an expansive view of what success looks like at the very top, it only intensifies this larger trend of different career pathing and planning approaches. So I think there's two things to do, right? One is, and we all know this, but it's making sure we execute on this. We have to tap into a broader, more diverse talent pool who have different experiences. That's how we navigate the unknown, because we actually have an incredible amount of capabilities. We just don't know it. I can't tell you how many people I talk to who say, we just don't know what we have. So that's number one. We have to expand our view and our understanding of who's in our organization. I think the second piece is we've got to look at business impact rather than role or rank. We sort of live in this boundaryless world now, and so we can constrain our own efforts if we look at maybe traditional decision-making criteria, because that's what we've done in the past. So a lot of what we're trying to think about is how can we prioritize different measurements? So I'll give you an example. Competencies, they're near and dear to my heart. I love them. I've built models. I've had them in my organizations, and they matter. But what happens is a lot of your talent starts to cluster really closely together. So it doesn't differentiate who you have when you need to make decisions. And so instead, if you look at something like impact, what are the accomplishments? What are the experiences that have impacted the business? To me, that's a critical part of planning for the unknown, because it differentiates your talent. It gives you a better sense of the broad capacity that you have. And then you can tie people to business outcomes regardless of traditional structures or hierarchies. So, for me, planning for the unknown, it's something we've lived in for a long time, we'll continue to live in, but we've got to consider that broader pool. We can't wait until they're in the top two levels of the organization. We've lost too many by then. And we have to really start thinking about impact to business that is very transferable, rather than, level, structure, hierarchy, silos that we tend to live in today.
And you and I have had several conversations on this. I think you hit it on the head. And one of the things that's a component of what you just shared is not only looking at skills and tasks and capabilities and business outcomes, but also shifting the horizon, right? So you're not necessarily focused and planning for role and title. You're planning for those level things, skills and tasks and capabilities and outcomes, and what are the components that comprise those things, and how do we plan for who we have in the organization that can do that, especially with the pace of change. You know, there was a piece of research from Gartner that also surveyed CHROs, and it said that most organizations expect that 40% of the roles they're currently planning for will change significantly in less than 5 years. So if you think about it, you know, 15 of the top 25 most in-demand roles this year didn't exist 15 years ago. And the same goes for executive roles. When we think about the C-suite, you know, we now have a chief experience officer and a chief sustainability officer and a chief innovation officer and a chief privacy officer. So this requires additional visibility to things like adjacent skills and a more dynamic and agile approach to leadership profiles that are going to come from a variety of different areas. So I think that's a big part of how you kind of plan for the unknown, is by just getting better at putting your arms around what you know. Next question I wanted to ask. You have to know what you have, exactly. The next question I wanted to ask, and I think we started to touch on this, is what does this new form of planning look like? I think, you know, the way I've tried to build the story here is, for a while, you know, in the last few years, we've talked about dynamic teams. And then, you know, as AI and machine learning has gotten involved, we've talked about dynamic skills and dynamic skilling. And I think now we're moving towards a period of dynamic planning. What do you think about that? You agree with that?
I love it. And actually, wouldn't that be a fantastic way to brand it at an organization that would get people excited? You know, when we think about how we plan, it's not a people process, it's a business initiative, right? Think of it like risk management or business continuity planning. That is the dynamic planning, right? So we have to shift our mindset of how we look at these different things that we do around talent and leadership planning. So what you can do with that dynamic approach is have scenario planning, right? And that should be a discipline for every organization. How do we cultivate talent across multiple time horizons, across different strategy scenarios, and have that be open to influence and scrutiny? Because the outcome isn't about the individual you selected who's leading. It's about how the business operates, right? And so reframing this and what we're delivering is really important. And to do that successful dynamic scenario planning, you have to have data to drive an objective process and a consistent set of information. Again, how do we know what we have? Well, we have to take an approach that will give us that information in a usable way consistently across the organization. So we've got to leverage data. We can no longer accept having these data gaps. I hear a lot of people talk about that. Well, we have this piece and we've got that piece, but we don't know that. I think by reframing this into its broader business initiative, it's a standard part of business planning. So connect it to strategy, because that's about whether or not the company is ready to step into the larger responsibility. And with data, now you can deliver effective leadership and governance of the organization, regardless of what's coming. So that's, to me, the shift in how we actually execute planning differently. It's scenario planning. It's ongoing. It's not just a talent process that we do, you know, as a standard part of our yearly people initiatives.
And a question that comes up often when we talk about this is, how does this play out in a remote or, you know, hybrid environment? And I think you already started to touch on the answer. As much as the data gives you better visibility to the organization, it now gives you better visibility to an organization that you may not be seeing in front of you every day. Correct?
That's right. And it now needs to deliver value, not just to the organization, but to the employee themselves, right? So it needs to have that level of transparency. And I think that's something we've all struggled with. Who owns talent? How transparent should we be about where they fit in the organization? I think the days of asking those questions are gone. That's already here. They're already demanding to know these things. They want to grow in the organization, but they need to know how, and they need to have some clear path and vision of how to navigate that. So, you know, for me, again, it goes back to that point of how do you leverage high tech to go high touch? We live in a high tech world of how we all work today. It isn't just high touch, so that means it's not going to be equal access and opportunity. Therefore, we have to use high tech processes and platforms to make sure that we're connecting and understanding the people in our organization. So we need to pull it all together in that digital view so that we can focus on making sure the employees are getting what they need to continue to grow with the organization.
So one of the things that, although all of this is difficult, and especially creating transparency and becoming more visible is always difficult, one of the things that's more easy to tackle is having that conversation from the organizational perspective. But how do we kind of account for the employee perspective, to have more open conversations around succession planning. And it's not just an organizational process, it's now kind of an interactive process that evolves over time and develops between conversations with managers and employees. How do we kind of build that culture that has this more of a two-way conversation than how it's traditionally been done in the past?
Yeah, I mean, I had a conversation with a person who heads up executive talent at a financial services firm. And what she said to me, she said, what keeps me up at night is who's walking out the door that I don't know. And so this is incredibly important. And as you said, if we know people are going to leave to pursue other opportunities, it's still a tight labor market, and yet we need to continue to drive value for our businesses. We have to focus on our appreciative asset, which is our people. And so, you know, one thing is, I think there's often fear about what if we're, you know, do people think then they will have that job because we talked about it, or do I have to deliver something to them? I think we've got to break it down. We get right to the decision and the outcome. And instead, what I think people are really craving and looking for is a more steady conversation about it. You know, we all know performance management processes, which most people dread, but, you know, is it the opportunity, if you're doing that consistently, to have this conversation? Do we ask our employees, what are you interested in? What are you doing outside of work? Where do you see yourself going someday? I think we have to have the answers, and that's preventing us from simply having a conversation, which says, "Hey, gosh, you know, I don't know exactly what that will look like, but let me connect you to this person, or let's continue the conversation. What are you going to do to pursue that?" So don't be afraid to have the conversation because you think you have to know how to get somebody there. I think just the process of starting to engage them meaningfully is critical. And there's really simple ways to do that. Obviously, there's platforms and technology, but there's also just building that in as a standard process of how we behave and operate every day.
So we started the discussion kind of far out with our survey and our research, and then we started getting closer and closer to the organization and to the actual practitioners and leaders. I now kind of wanted to move to an opportunity for you to give us like a real life scenario of a specific client example that you've worked with.
Sure, absolutely. So, you know, again, we're working to be disruptive in the sense of take traditional leadership practices and find new digital approaches to them. And so we were working with an energy client, and obviously that's an industry going through massive transformation. And a question that they had across the board is, how will we be able to lead our business through this transformation? Will we be able to? And to feel confident that they can answer yes to that, they identified 4 business goals that you see here, right? Accelerating leadership growth, but knowing how and where and when to invest in our people. Driving innovation by having those diverse leaders who are going to have different perspectives and accomplishments. Ensuring continuity by having viable successors. I think we've all been in the position where key talent leaves and it's highly disruptive to how the business operates. And how can we be future ready? Can we actually define what we're going to need for the future? If it's not in the most specific sense, what are some of those broader goals around flexibility or creativity? So our platform, Heidrick Navigator, really is there to deliver leadership intelligence so that you can manage, measure, and meet these goals. So if you know who you have, we've talked about that theme today, and you define what you need into the future, the intelligence platform can then compare the two. And now you have this always on approach to succession, to scenario planning. And you can show the return, which is the most important and often the hardest part of this, which is, you know, some KPIs we had here. How do we increase the number of leaders actively managing their own development? We can put a metric on that and track who's creating their plans, progress they've had. We can reassess and see what growth they've had, right? So that's an example. How do we increase pipelines that have creativity and flexibility, things I just talked about, or increase the number of cross-functional promotions and placements? I was talking to a CEO and he said, we want to move from 5% to 30% internal mobility cross-functionally. What was really powerful about these 2 clients who are looking at that is they kind of ripped up the playbook. We talked about that at the beginning, and they just said, if that's the metric, how do we design a process that will get us there? Instead of saying, what are all the things we have today and just trying to, you know, figure out how to, you know, do them a little bit differently. So that's an example of where we're trying to really bring a platform approach, an innovative new digital way of looking at succession planning, scenario planning, but they're grounded in business goals to ensure that you can lead into the future And it isn't going to be a year-long process. You get the data up and running very quickly, and now they have a powerful way to show where they're going with their efforts.
And just as a nice summary of this session, we wanted to leave the folks with some key takeaways. And really, it's around using that data in a dynamic way that has some capability potentially with advanced technology like AI or machine learning, so it's constantly updating and dynamic to generate deeper analysis and insights. And then to be able to monitor and create opportunities at every level, especially with the fluctuating nature of skills, for how skills are emerging and how skills are declining. In many cases, the skills you need to monitor may not be at the levels you're currently planning with things like succession planning. And then take a broader view on those critical roles and focus on business outcomes. And again, it's the ability to identify future leaders that align with emerging skills so that your talent planning actually reaches the same place your business is heading when you get there. And these plans move into more usable outcomes than historically as they've turned into shelfware. So wanted to leave you with these key takeaways. We thank you for the time and the chance to join the agenda today. And just wanted to say thanks again for giving us the opportunity.